Earlier in this unit, we looked at the rise of dictators and talked about how and why Germans might have approved or at least tolerated the rise of Hitler. Do you remember any of the reasons we explored back then? Well, there was economic catastrophe. After World War I, Germany suffered first from hyperinflation, where people had to bring wheelbarrows of money to the store just to buy a loaf or two of bread. Then they got hit by the Great Depression, and huge numbers of Germans lost their jobs. Hitler promised to restore prosperity to Germany, and his big spending programs did help the unemployed. There was the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty forced Germany to pay heavy reparations to the Allies, a big reason for the hyperinflation since Germany just printed money to pay those bills. The treaty also forced Germany to accept a war guilt clause that gave them full responsibility for the war when, frankly, there was plenty of responsibility and blame to go around. There was widespread dismay at what was seen as degenerate post-war culture. Remember money, money, money? There was the longing to return to the sense of unity, national togetherness that many people had experienced during the war, terrible as it had been. And finally, there was a desire to blame someone else for Germany's troubles. You now know where Hitler placed the blame and the terrible consequences. So at this point, I'd like to take up a slightly different, though related question. Why did the rest of the world let Hitler get away with the persecution of the Jews, the recreation of a powerful German military, and the German conquest of more and more of its neighbors? Hitler came to power in 1933. World War II started in the fall of 1939. So what I'm really asking is what happened during those 6 years, excuse me, and why didn't the countries of Europe stop it? So here is one cartoonist's theory. This cartoon was published in 1941. Who was the cartoonist? I'll bet you can guess. Yep, it's Dr. Seuss, or Theodor Geisel. I whited out his name in the previous slide. So Dr. Seuss began writing children's books in the 1930s, but he was also a journalist, and he also drew political cartoons. During World War II, he wrote them for a New York magazine called PM. So this cartoon, again, was published in 1941, just before America entered World War II, something that Dr. Seuss thought they should do. The fellow in the middle is Britain's prime minister from the late 1930s, a man named Neville Chamberlain. You're going to see him on video a little bit later today. Here he is nicknamed the Appeaser. And what lollipops would you guess he was offering all those Nazi sea monsters? Well, the answer is that the lollipops were territory. And to understand what that means, we really need to go back to our maps for a minute. So here is Europe in 1914. East Central Europe before World War I was dominated by 3 great empires: Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. All 3 empires disintegrated during or after the First World War. Russia, you may recall, had a communist revolution, and it lost a lot of its western territories to new or old but newly independent countries, the Baltic nations of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and also Poland. Austria-Hungary was split into 2 countries, and some of the territory became the new countries, excuse me, part of the territory, the Austrian Empire became the new countries of Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. It's a little hard to see this from the map, but Germany itself was split up. See that little patch of pink on top of Poland? That's East Prussia, part of Germany, but it was cut off from the rest by what was called the Danzig corridor, that upper little bit of Poland that sticks up toward the sea. So let's return to the People's Century video series to take a closer look at these developments. On your quiz, you're going to need to be able to identify the big changes that took place in the map of Europe, so take notes. This is a very busy map of the former Austrian-Hungarian Empire, but all you really need to know from it is that it shows ethnic groups or nationalities, people who identified themselves by their language, by their religion as belonging to a nation. That dark pink or red represents Germans. That means people who spoke German, who considered themselves to be Germans. Notice that what would become Austria is German. and that there are big groups of Germans in Bohemia and Moravia, what would become Czechoslovakia, and throughout areas that would become Poland, Hungary, and Romania. Part of what's going on here is that in many parts of Eastern Europe, the Germans had actually been the ruling elite, the nobility. The Slavs were often the peasants. So one of American President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points was self-determination. I'm sorry. The idea that people who identify themselves as a nation should have their own state. This map should show that there were some serious limitations to that notion and some serious dangers. So let's watch another short clip from the People's Century video. This is a German postcard that was produced soon after the Treaty of Versailles, and it shows the lands where Germans lived. The areas in red are lands that were given to other countries by the Treaty of Versailles, including, of course, land lost by Austria. So what does this have to do with the rest of the world letting Hitler get away with his gruesome plans? The answer is that many people thought that Hitler's initial territorial grabs were more or less fair. According to the principle of self-determination, Germany had been treated unfairly by the Treaty of Versailles. Remember this slide? What was its message? Well, as tempers cooled after World War I, many people, including many people in England especially, concluded that the terms of the Treaty of Versailles had been too harsh. They blamed the reparations for some of the economic disasters that followed, and in fact, they were right. So, more and more Europeans tended to sympathize with Germany's efforts to escape the limitations posed by the Treaty of Versailles. And here's another reason why Europe initially allowed Hitler to get away with it. In the years after World War I, people became less willing to blame Germany for the war and more willing to blame an arms race that had preceded the war. By the way, this is a good example of the difference between correlation and causation. Yes, a war came after England and Germany and France had been building up their armies and navies and eventually their air forces. The question is, did that cause the war, or was it because tensions were increasing and war was coming? In fact, there will be a major military buildup, a very reluctant military buildup in 1938 and 1939, which is really caused not by a desire to build lots of tanks and airplanes, but by Hitler's aggressive actions. But at any rate, to return, during the 1920s and early 1930s, political leaders in Europe outside of Germany faced more and more pressure to disarm their militaries and to renounce war. So what is this cartoon saying? It's actually a reference to a famous quote from Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar. One of the characters, Mark Antony, gives a famous speech. It's basically his eulogy to Caesar, and he predicts that Caesar's ghost will return and proclaim, "Cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war." In other words, all hell will break loose, as in fact it did in the Roman Empire as it made the transition to the Roman Republic as it made the transition to Roman Empire. So basically, this 1919 cartoon is saying that the League is going to keep those dogs of war muzzled up. It's going to leash them so that they can't slip off. A lot of people believe that. Earlier in the same speech from Shakespeare, Mark Antony gives this famous and gruesome description of war. Blood and destruction shall be so in use, in other words, they will be so common, and dreadful objects so familiar that mothers shall but smile when they behold their infants quartered with the hands of war. In other words, mothers are just going to smile when their babies are cut up. Unlikely, it seems to me, but a very dramatic image. After World War I, many women resolved that they were not going to sit back and smile while a bunch of male political leaders let slip the dogs of war. And remember, of course, that in many, many countries, women now actually had the vote. So the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom was a very powerful movement that collected more than 6 million signatures in the years leading up to the League of Nations' long postponed but finally held Disarmament Conference. The poster you see is one of their many propaganda posters. So let's watch another short video clip about the push for disarmament. You'll see some of these petitions being delivered to the League. So the Disarmament Conference disbanded without disarming, in part because Hitler came to power in the middle of it, and he was clearly bent on rearmament. Hitler, by the way, withdrew from the League of Nations. So what is the message of this cartoon? Who are the animals up on stage supposed to represent, and who are the sheep? Well, those predatory, big-toothed animals are obviously the political leaders, and the sheep, the common people of the world, are waiting for disarmament. As we'll see in just a few minutes, the League of Nations proved quite unable to prevent aggression. But the drive for disarmament does suggest another reason why the world did not stop Hitler. Many people truly believe that it was military weapons and not the political leaders who ordered the construction and use of these weapons that caused war. Also, the early mid 1930s were the height of the Depression. Money spent on airplanes, tanks, and destroyers was money that wasn't going to be available to help the unemployed. So what does this chart about military spending tell us? It's from the 1930s. First, what country really boosts its military spending around 1933? And the answer is the USSR, or Soviet Communist Russia under Stalin. Then, starting around 1934, German military spending begins to increase very rapidly. In the late 1930s, British military spending begins to increase a little, but everybody else, except Japan, which is engaged in its own aggressive efforts, stays pretty flat. So let's get back to Dr. Seuss. What reasons does he suggest in this cartoon for why Americans might have been willing to accept Hitler? And by the way, the same reason was given for why many in Britain would. Or at least why they might not worry about him very much. Well, I've given you a hint by circling one answer: anti-Russian propaganda. A lot of people thought that Hitler, nasty a little creature as he was, might at least help keep Soviet Russia in check. And as we just saw in the chart, there were reasons to worry about Stalin's Russia. Russia was spending huge sums of money on the military. Stalin made no secret that he wanted to get back some of the territory Russia had lost after World War I, and a lot of the news out of Stalin's Russia was pretty alarming. The body count from Stalin's forced famines would ultimately be even higher than the body count in the Holocaust. Many people rather hoped that Hitler's Germany would keep Stalin's Russia in check. It didn't quite work out that way. Stay tuned. I mentioned that the German economy revived under Hitler. This graph shows the percent change in German national income. Notice that the German economy declines almost 8% in 1931 and 32, and then it rises 8 to 10% or even above 10% in the years leading up to the start of World War II in 1939. No other countries in Europe had those kinds of figures. Here, for example, we see Britain's economy over the same period. Now, the two charts use a somewhat different scale, which is a little confusing, but the scale is quite clear. And what you can see is that British economic growth in the late 1930s was less than half of Germany's. So what effect would this have on willingness to challenge the rise of Nazi Germany? Well, on the one hand, it gave a lot of ammunition to Hitler admirers. There were people who were willing to assume that he was just blowing hot air with all that talk about the Jews, and look what he's doing for the German economy. Slower economic growth in Britain and other European countries also meant, of course, that they had less money to spend on rearming, even if they had the political will to rebuild their militaries. Here's one final reason why the world didn't stop Hitler early on, when it would have saved millions of lives. Initially, a lot of people simply didn't take Hitler seriously. So what is this American newspaper cartoon suggesting? Well, the cartoonist basically thinks that the conservative German leaders will reel Hitler in if he becomes too dangerous or gets too carried away with his crazy theories. Basically, this is portraying Hitler as a silly little boy playing soldier. This British cartoon has a very similar message. Hitler is shown as a child playing dress-up. Actually, this cartoonist, David Lowe, helped lead the fight to get Britain to take Hitler's threat more seriously, but this is a pretty early cartoon. So let's recap, and you should have this in your notes. I sense an accept question coming, maybe even essay question coming. Here are some of the reasons why Hitler got away with rearming and then gobbling up surrounding territory. Germany's first territorial grabs didn't seem so unreasonable since they were places where mostly Germans lived. This seemed to be following the principle of self-determination. Citizens were pressing their governments to disarm. People put their hopes in the League of Nations to prevent war. The Depression meant less money to spend on defense. Germany seemed to have found a successful economic formula. Many people outside of Germany also thought the Treaty of Versailles had been unfair to Germany. And Russia seemed even scarier. Germany might be a counterweight against Russia. Finally, Hitler couldn't mean all those crazy things, could he? He must be fooling. So I've been talking about why Europe didn't stop Hitler early on. Now let's turn to the actual events that led up to the start of the war. You should write down this timeline in your notes. The first breach in the peace actually came from Japan, which invaded Manchuria in 1931. And the League of Nations ordered Japan to leave Manchuria, and Japan just left the League of Nations, which proved powerless to do anything to stop the Japanese invasion of a large chunk of China. Mussolini and Hitler, of course, took note. In 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia. Remember that Ethiopians had defeated Italy the first time back in the 1890s. This time the Italians succeeded. They seized Ethiopia as a new colony. It was a further indication to the people of Italy and Europe that Mussolini was more powerful, more effective than earlier Italian leaders. Let's return to the People's Century video. So what's Dr. Seuss suggesting here? Again, these cartoons are all from 1941. Well, people just didn't want to believe bad news. They hoped Hitler didn't mean a lot of what he said. But one person who did keep delivering bad news was Winston Churchill, who was not in power and was basically speaking from political exile. So let's turn now to a quote in your notes from a speech that he gave in 1934. That's just a year after Hitler came to power and really before most people were worrying that much about him. What is Hitler saying? And then let's return to our People's Century video and see Hitler in person and the reaction to what he had to say. So think about, how would you have sided back in the 1930s with Churchill, who was calling on Britain to rearm, or the citizens demanding peace through reason? The video doesn't really talk about this, but part of what made the next step in aggression, the Spanish Civil War, so terrible and so clear a warning about what was coming was that Germany and Italy gave military support to the nationalist side. In fact, the German military really used Spain as an opportunity to try out a lot of the new weapons that had been developing. Guernica, the painting you see here, is one of the most famous paintings of the 20th century, really a gruesome, if somewhat abstract, portrait of what happened. And it depicts a real event, which was the bombing by the German Luftwaffe of the small Spanish Basque town of Guernica during the Spanish Civil War. So now we're turning to the main event, a series of steps that Hitler took to expand Germany's borders and create so-called Lebensraum, or living space for Germans. Keep filling out your timeline as you watch this next portion of the video. We've already seen Dr. Seuss's view of the Munich Agreement, admittedly drawn 3 years after the agreement was signed, when World War II was well underway in Europe and Hitler's dishonesty had been fully exposed. Still, the cartoon could have been drawn in 1938 because this really was the theory behind Munich's peace in our time. You saw Neville Chamberlain, right? One more concession to Hitler, and maybe he'd be satisfied and stop. He's saying that, right? Well, here's another Seuss cartoon along the same lines. It's hard after the fact to make excuses for Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain or for the crowds that cheered him when we returned from Germany. But then we know what's coming next. If we try to put ourselves into the shoes of people living in England and France, the story is a little more complicated. Up until now, every piece of territory that Hitler had seized was German-speaking territory occupied by people who mostly wanted to be part of Germany. Wasn't Hitler just fulfilling Woodrow Wilson's call for national self-determination? Hadn't the Versailles Treaty been unfair to Germany? And of course, that's what Hitler was saying as well. Your notes template includes an excerpt from a speech he made at the 1938 Nazi Party Conference. Read it and ask yourself, doesn't it sound pretty reasonable? Of course, he had his fingers crossed. And, of course, we know what happens next. Let's finish our pre-war timeline with the last clip or two clips from the People's Century, and then we will turn, alas, all too briefly, to the actual course of World War II.